An Interpol officer tased a royal guard in uniform on duty at the palace gates. Cameras flashed. Tourists gasped. But the man in red didn't flinch, not even a little. So what happened next? 5 minutes later, black Land Rovers appeared out of nowhere and sealed off every road leading to the palace. And they weren't there for show. Want to know how it all escalated? Who the guard really was and why the ministry didn't call the police? They sent them. Hit that subscribe button first and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's dive in. The southwest gates of St. James's Palace don't just look old, they feel ancient. Iron blackened by centuries of London weather. Gold leaf worn smooth in places where millions of hands have touched the ornate scrollwork. The stones beneath your feet have been walked by monarchs, ministers, and common folk for over 400 years. Stand there long enough and you start to understand why people whisper. Not out of courtesy, but out of instinct. Something in the air tells you this place has seen empires rise and fall. It was just past 9 in the morning when the usual crowd gathered. American tourists clutching steaming coffee cups from the Starbucks near Green Park. Pensioners with their walking sticks and sensible shoes, who'd probably seen this ceremony a dozen times but never tired of it. Families with children who kept tugging on their parents' sleeves asking if the guard was real or just a very good statue. That familiar hush you get at places where history doesn't need to announce itself. It just stands there, patient and permanent, waiting for you to understand its weight. The morning had that crisp October quality that makes London look like a painting. Sharp shadows, golden light catching on windows, the kind of air that makes you pull your coat a little tighter while still wanting to stay outside. Street sweepers had finished their rounds an hour earlier, leaving the cobblestones spotless. Even the pigeons seemed to respect the solemnity, perching quietly on the ornate lampposts rather than their usual chaotic swooping. And at the centre of it all stood Lance Corporal Kieran Wolfe. Perfect doesn't begin to describe it. His crimson tunic looked like it had been pressed with a knife edge. White gloves so clean they practically glowed. That ceremonial sabre hanging at exactly the right angle, its curved blade catching morning sunlight like a mirror made of steel. To everyone watching, he was the postcard, the perfect picture of British pageantry. Polished, pristine, untouchable. Here's what those tourists didn't know about the man standing so still behind those gates. Wolfe had spent 7 years with the Parachute Regiment, 3 para to be precise. Sierra Leone first, back in 2000, when he was barely 20 and thought he understood what courage looked like. Then 2 tours in Afghanistan that taught him the difference between bravery and survival. And Province, 2008 and 2010. He'd held a forward observation post for 14 hours straight while Taliban fighters tried to overrun their position. Watched a 19-year-old corporal bleed out in his arms because the medical evacuation couldn't reach them through the sniper fire. There was shrapnel buried in his left shoulder from an IED that had flipped their warrior vehicle outside Kandahar, metal fragments too close to his spine for the surgeons to risk removing. Airport security scanners still made him raise his arms and explain the pins in his knee, the titanium plate along his collarbone. His right hand trembled sometimes when he was tired, legacy of a blast that had killed 2 of his mates and left him with a concussion that took months to properly heal. But none of it showed in the ceremonial line. The pain had been folded into him, like the crease in his collar, like the angle of his boots, like the muscle memory of standing at attention for hours without shifting weight. He'd learned to breathe through discomfort in places where showing weakness could get people killed. The discipline of silence wasn't ceremony to him. It was survival instinct refined into art. If you knew what to look for, the way he favoured his right leg by millimetres, the controlled breathing pattern of someone managing chronic pain, the slight cant of his left shoulder, you could read the map of his service record written in flesh and bone. But tourists don't look for those things. They see the uniform, the pageantry, the tradition. To them, he was just part of the show. That was about to change, because at precisely 9:12 a.m., a black Peugeot with foreign plates rolled to a stop 20 feet closer to the gates than any civilian vehicle had a right to be. The engine cut off, the passenger door opened, and something in the morning air shifted, like the moment before a thunderstorm when you can feel the pressure drop. The man who stepped out wore no uniform, but he carried himself like someone who thought he didn't need one. Adrien Moreau, mid-30s, Interpol liaison out of Lyon, supposedly attached to some joint operation between Europol and the London Met. But his file told a different story. 3 disciplinary actions for overzealous fieldwork, 2 formal complaints from British counterparts about unauthorised surveillance, and a pattern of operating beyond his mandate that had landed him in increasingly peripheral assignments. This morning's visit wasn't officially sanctioned. He'd driven down from a terrorism conference in Manchester, told his supervisor he was conducting cultural liaison research on British security protocols. In reality, he was nursing a grudge against what he saw as British superiority complex, all that pomp and circumstance hiding what he believed was fundamental weakness. Tactical vest under a civilian jacket, dark jeans, boots polished to that particular shine that screams law enforcement. A laminated badge swung from a lanyard around his neck. Valid credentials, but for a different operation entirely. The kind of badge-heavy presentation that works on civilians who don't know how to read jurisdictional fine print. Didn't glance at the stewards positioning themselves nervously near the rope barriers. Didn't acknowledge the crowd already reaching for their phones. His eyes went straight to Wolf. And then he started walking, not running, not shouting, just walking with that particular kind of confidence that comes from believing rules apply to other people. One of the stewards stepped forward, hand raised in the universal gesture of, "Stop right there." "Excuse me, sir, this is a restricted ceremonial area. You'll need to stay behind the barriers." Moreau didn't even slow down. He lifted that laminated badge lazily, let it drop back against his chest. "Interpol, Joint Security Oversight. I'm cleared for field observation." The steward's voice took on that strained politeness that security personnel use when they're trying to avoid an incident. "Sir, that clearance doesn't extend to ceremonial boundaries. You're approaching an active guard post under sovereign protection." "I'm not interfering," Moreau said, stepping over the rope line like it was a suggestion. "Just observing. You people care about international optics, right?" By the time the steward opened his mouth to protest again, Moreau had already closed the distance. He stopped less than 3 feet from the tip of Wolf's sabre. The crowd noticed. Voices dropped to whispers, then stopped altogether. Phones rose. Dozens of them, sensing that something was happening here that might be worth recording. German family moved closer to the barriers, the father translating quietly for his children, in rapid, concerned German. 2 teenage girls, from what sounded like Australia, stopped taking selfies and just stared, suddenly understanding that this wasn't part of the normal tourist experience. An elderly gentleman with a veteran's pin on his lapel took off his cap and held it against his chest, his weathered face grim with recognition. He'd seen this kind of confrontation before. Someone with just enough authority to be dangerous, not enough wisdom to use it properly. The morning crowd had swelled to maybe 40 people now, drawn by that inexplicable magnetism of tension. The tour guide with a small group of Japanese visitors tried to quietly move them along, but they resisted, sensing something significant was unfolding. The usual chatter of London street life, car engines, distant sirens, the rumble of buses, seemed to fade into background noise, and Wolf didn't move, not even a blink. His gaze remained locked on that invisible point, somewhere beyond the gates, past Marlborough Road, fixed on whatever horizon guards are trained to watch. But you could feel something in his stillness now, not just ceremonial discipline, but the coiled readiness of someone who'd learned to remain calm when violence was coming. Moreau studied him, like a man trying to decide if a museum display was real or just well-crafted replica. "Do you speak?" he asked, voice pitched just loud enough for the tourists to hear. No response. Do you even breathe? Still nothing. Moreau leaned in slightly, that predatory smile spreading across his face. You know, I've walked prisoners through interrogation blocks in 5 countries. I've seen better posture from men who hadn't eaten in 3 days. Behind the barriers, phones were recording now. The steward was speaking urgently into his radio. Control, this is Gate 2. We have a breach of ceremonial protocol by foreign agency personnel, requesting immediate guidance, but Moreau wasn't done testing limits. This is what passes for security in Britain, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. A mannequin in fancy dress? I've seen street performers with more presence. A few tourists exchanged uncomfortable glances. An elderly woman whispered to her husband that perhaps they should move along. But they didn't move, because something about this felt important, even if they couldn't say why. Moreau reached slowly into his jacket. Not fast enough to alarm anyone, but deliberate enough to make every security person in the area tense up. When his hand emerged, it wasn't holding a gun. It was holding a compact black device with yellow markings. A taser. Civilian model, non-lethal, completely legal in most circumstances, completely unauthorized here. Let's see if this statue twitches, he said, with that same predatory grin. Sir, no! The steward lunged forward, but he was too far away. The taser clicked, armed. Several tourists gasped. A child whispered, Is that man going to hurt the soldier? And Wolf remained motionless. The weapon discharged with a sharp crack and a flash of blue-white light. The dart struck Wolf directly in the thigh, just below the edge of his red tunic. 50,000 volts coursed through his body at 15 cycles per second. In Afghanistan, Wolf had been shot. He'd been concussed by explosions close enough to kill. He'd operated for hours with a dislocated shoulder and 3 cracked ribs. But electricity was different. It bypassed every mental defense, every trained response, every bit of conditioned toughness. For 5 seconds, his nervous system belonged to the machine in Moreau's hand. His jaw clenched involuntarily. His fingers spasmed around the saber hilt, grip tightening until the leather wrapping bit into his palm through the white gloves. Every muscle in his core contracted like a fist. The smell of burnt wool began to rise as from where the probes had penetrated the ceremonial fabric. But his boots never left the ground. His spine never bent. His eyes never moved from that fixed point ahead. When the current stopped, Lance Corporal Wolf stood exactly as he had before. If anything, he looked taller. The only sounds were the dying crackle of electrical discharge and the sharp intake of breath from 40 tourists who had just witnessed something they couldn't quite process. You could smell it now, the acrid scent of electrical burn mixing with the morning air. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the entry point where synthetic fabric had melted against wool. Wolf's breathing was deeper now, more controlled, the pattern of someone managing pain that went beyond anything ceremonial training had prepared him for. The silence that followed wasn't the respectful quiet of tourists anymore. This was the heavy silence that comes after violence, the kind that makes people hold their breath and wonder what happens next. Moreau stepped back, the discharged taser hanging loose in his hand. Impressive, he said, almost to himself. Maybe you're not just for show after all. But if you looked closely, if you knew what to look for, you could see the evidence. A small dark stain spreading through the wool of Wolf's breeches where the dart had penetrated. A thin line of blood seeping through his white glove where his grip had tightened on the sword hilt. And still, he stood. From somewhere deep within the palace, shadows were already moving. The steward's voice crackled over the radio again, using those clipped codes that mean situations have moved beyond routine. Black level breach confirmed. All units escalate to protocol flag grey. Hostile action against ceremonial personnel. Command response required immediately. Within 60 seconds, the heavy security doors of the west portico opened. Three figures emerged, moving with the kind of purpose that makes smart people start paying very close attention. Not palace guards, not stewards. These men wore matte black tactical gear with the subtle gleam of body armor underneath. Green armbands, stitched with silver thread, marked them as something different entirely. Royal Military Police. The lead figure moved with surgical precision. Captain Rowan Pierce, late 40s, clean-shaven, steel-grey eyes that had seen enough protocol breaches to handle this one before breakfast. His boots struck the ancient flagstones with deliberate rhythm as he closed the distance. Behind him, Corporal Vaughan and Specialist Lennox spread out to create a triangle of authority around Moreau. No running, no shouting. Just that particular kind of professional movement that makes experienced troublemakers start cooperating immediately. Captain Pierce stopped exactly one pace outside, striking distance, and spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the suddenly quiet courtyard. "Drop the weapon." Moreau hesitated, his eyes darting between the three RMP officers who had materialized around him. His voice carried that defensive tone people use when they realize they might have misjudged the situation. "You're overreacting. This was equipment testing, harmless. It's not even a full voltage device." "You've just discharged an electronic weapon against a ceremonial soldier under sovereign protection," Captain Pierce replied, his voice flat as concrete. "That's not harmless. That's a breach of Article 12 under the Armed Forces Protection Charter." Moreau let out a bark of nervous laughter. "I'm Interpol, field liaison. This is clearly a misunderstanding between allied agencies." Captain Pierce took half a step forward, not aggressive, just enough to make his point clear. "If you were legitimate Interpol, you'd know exactly how many international treaties you've just walked through, and you'd know that misunderstanding isn't a valid legal category under this jurisdiction." You could see Moreau's confidence starting to crack around the edges. The tourists behind the barriers had gone completely silent now, phones still recording, but somehow it felt wrong to keep filming. Like they were about to witness something that wasn't meant for casual entertainment. "I want my consulate contacted," Moreau snapped, trying to regain some authority. "I demand legal oversight under diplomatic protocols." Captain Pierce raised a single gloved hand. Corporal Vaughan stepped forward smoothly and extended an open palm. "Weapon! Now!" The pause stretched for 2 long heartbeats. Then Moreau exhaled sharply and dropped the taser into Vaughan's waiting hand. No sudden movements, no more swagger. Just the quiet resignation of someone who'd finally realized how badly they'd miscalculated. Captain Pierce didn't look at the weapon. He looked straight past Moreau and addressed Wolfe directly. "Lance Corporal Wolfe," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, "are you capable of maintaining your post?" For a moment, Wolfe's jaw flexed slightly, the first real sign of human response he'd shown since the whole ordeal began. His lips didn't part, but something shifted in his posture. A recognition between soldiers. Then, without moving his eyes from that fixed point ahead, without looking down at his captain, he spoke. "Still fit for duty, sir." His voice wasn't loud, but in the hushed courtyard, it landed like a stone dropped into still water. Captain Pierce gave a single sharp nod, professional acknowledgement between military personnel. Then he turned to Corporal Vaughan. "Secure the suspect. Notify Sovereign Command that we have a hostile foreign national in custody." "Yes, sir." As Vaughan and Lennox moved to restrain Moreau, not roughly but with unmistakable finality, the first dark shapes appeared at the top of the road. Black Land Rovers. 2 at first, then 3, then 5. These weren't ordinary government vehicles. Range Rover Sentinels, armoured to withstand small arms fire and explosive devices, their windows tinted to levels that made reading the occupants impossible. The kind of transportation reserved for royalty, senior cabinet ministers, and situations where discretion was less important than making a statement. They moved in perfect convoy formation down the narrow street, lead vehicle, command vehicle, support vehicles, with motorcycle outriders that had appeared from side streets like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. No sirens, but every other vehicle on the road had somehow melted away, leaving clear passage for the convoy. Land Rover's engine was so well tuned you could barely hear it over the London traffic. But when it stopped, the silence seemed to spread outward like ripples on water. The diplomatic plates weren't random letters and numbers. They were specific sequences that traffic police and security personnel across London were trained to recognise and never, ever delay. Door handles turned in sequence. First the driver, protection officer, earpiece, eyes constantly scanning. Then the passenger door opened to reveal another plainclothes security officer, who stepped out and immediately began scanning rooftops and windows with the kind of systematic attention that suggested this wasn't their first high-stakes situation. Only then did the rear doors open, and out stepped Major Sophie Harland. You could feel the shift in atmosphere immediately. Ministry of Defence liaison, mid-40s, navy trench coat over immaculate dress uniform, moving with the kind of controlled authority that makes career officers straighten their spines without thinking about it. She didn't introduce herself, didn't need to. The stewards stepped aside. The tourists backed away instinctively. Even Captain Pierce adjusted his posture. Not subservient, just recognising rank. Major Harland walked straight past the barriers, past the RMP officers, past the detained Interpol agent. She stopped directly beside Lance Corporal Wolfe. From her inner coat pocket, she withdrew a small evidence bag containing the discharged taser cartridge, now tagged and catalogued. She held it up without turning her head. "Status of the guard?" she asked. Captain Pierce stepped beside her. "Assaulted with electrical weapon. Remained at post. Confirmed fit for continued duty." Major Harland looked up at Wolfe then, not for long, just enough to make eye contact. She didn't ask him a question, didn't expect a response. She simply said, "Good man." Then she turned to face Moreau, now flanked by RMP personnel and looking significantly less confident than he had 10 minutes earlier. "You're not getting a phone call," she said matter-of-factly. "Not yet." "This is a diplomatic disaster," Moreau protested, his voice taking on that desperate edge people get when they realise their situation is worse than they thought. "I'm protected under jurisdictional agreements." "No," Major Harland interrupted, her tone carrying the finality of someone who'd read those agreements more recently than he had. "You were protected under accords that presupposed good faith and professional conduct. You forfeited that protection the moment you assaulted a British soldier on sovereign ground." Moreau's jaw tightened. "You think I'm operating alone here?" Major Harland stepped closer, not threatening, just enough to make her point clear. "I think you just learned the difference between operational authority and institutional response." She turned to Captain Pierce. "Protocol Override 14 Alpha is now active. Lock down this quadrant. No one enters, no one leaves." "Understood, ma'am." What happened next wasn't dramatic. There were no sirens, no shouted orders, no Hollywood-style confrontations. The gates to St. James's Palace simply swung closed, not rushed, not slammed, but with absolute finality. Black vehicles moved to seal both ends of the street. Radio chatter increased, but remained calm and professional. Within minutes, the entire area had been transformed from a tourist attraction into a controlled security zone. And through it all, Wolfe maintained his position as he had from the beginning, silent, upright, unmoved by the chaos that had erupted around him. The message couldn't have been clearer if they'd hung a banner from the palace walls. This wasn't about revenge or retaliation. It was about drawing a line in the ancient stones and making sure everyone understood exactly where it lay. From the southern archway, a second ceremonial guard emerged, Lance Corporal Malik, already mounted, already in perfect dress uniform. The changeover happened with the kind of precision you only see in organisations that have been executing the same procedures for centuries. Wolf and Malik passed each other in mirror formation, spines straight, eyes forward. No acknowledgement of the crowd or the drama that had just unfolded. No words exchanged. No break in the ceremonial rhythm. Just duty, continuing uninterrupted. Wolf dismounted behind a privacy screen, where a military medic waited with gloves already on and a medical kit opened. He moved with just the slightest limp, barely noticeable unless you were watching for it, but he didn't lean on the offered support. He didn't speak. Didn't look back at the courtyard. Didn't give any sign that the assault had been anything more than part of the job. At the edge of the square, Major Harland was speaking quietly with Captain Pierce, their voices low, but carrying the weight of decisions being made. "We've confirmed Moreau's credentials," Pierce reported. "They're complicated." "Meaning?" "Valid Interpol field clearance, but his operational orders don't match anything in the embassy's files. No authorized training exercises this month. No liaison protocols activated. He came here on his own initiative." Major Harland's expression didn't change. "That makes this unauthorized foreign intelligence activity on Crown property. We're treating it as such. RMP has requested joint custody with MI5. "Denied," Harland said firmly. "We don't share jurisdiction on this one, not until we know how far this goes." Across the courtyard, Moreau was still protesting to anyone who would listen, his voice carrying that edge of desperation that comes when authority figures stop taking you seriously. "You have no idea what you're starting here," he called out. "I work with people who don't wait for diplomatic channels. This is bigger than your ceremonial protocols." Major Harland turned toward him, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to make it clear she'd heard him. "And we protect people who maintain their posts, even after being assaulted by foreign agents hiding behind expired authority," she replied. Her voice wasn't raised, but it cut through the morning air like a blade. "You want to know what's bigger than protocol?" she continued. "Tradition that doesn't need to justify itself to people who mistake credentials for character." Moreau's bluster faltered visibly. "Transfer him," Harland ordered. "Full detention, no communication until we determine who sent him and why." That simple command, the entire incident shifted from confrontation to consequence. Not through violence, not through escalation, through discipline, the real kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just acts. 10 minutes after he'd been escorted behind the medical screens, the sound of steel horseshoes rang out across the courtyard again. Lance Corporal Wolf re-emerged, remounted, and resumed his position at the gates. Same posture, same immaculate bearing, but something had changed, something the tourists couldn't quite articulate, but absolutely felt. This wasn't just a return to duty, this was a statement. His gloves were fresh now, crisp white fabric without a trace of blood. His breeches had been replaced. There was no visible evidence of what had happened, but everyone there knew, and knowing made the silence deeper, more respectful. A woman in her 60s, silver hair and a dark green scarf, spoke just loud enough for those around her to hear. "They endure for a reason," she said, watching Wolf settle back into his ceremonial stillness. A boy beside her whispered, "Is that the same guard who got hurt?" She didn't answer directly, just kept watching as Wolf found his position, one foot precisely beside the other, sabre angled perfectly at his side, eyes fixed on that infinite point ahead. Behind them, the German family was still there, the father now explaining to his children in quiet tones about discipline and dignity. The teenage Australian girls had put their phones away entirely, standing in respectful silence. Even the Japanese tour group had stopped moving, their guide abandoning his schedule in favour of this unplanned lesson in British character. The elderly veteran approached the barrier slowly, his cap still in his hands. When he reached the rope line, he simply stood at attention. Not perfect military bearing, his old bones wouldn't allow that, but recognisable respect from one soldier to another. He didn't salute, didn't speak. just stood there for a long moment before quietly walking away. And for everyone who had witnessed what came before, that stillness meant more than any speech or ceremony could have conveyed. It was proof that some things, the important things, don't break when tested. They just stand taller. So here's the question that matters. When someone with authority tries to humiliate you in public, what speaks louder, fighting back or refusing to be moved? And in our world of instant reactions and viral responses, is there still power in choosing dignity over drama? Let us know what you think in the comments below. These conversations about character, discipline, and the lines we refuse to cross, they matter more than you might realize. If this story changed how you think about strength, if it showed you something real about what authority actually looks like, hit that like button. It genuinely helps us reach more people. Subscribe and tap that notification bell so you never miss our daily stories about the remarkable men and women who guard these ancient traditions with quiet courage. And if you know someone who needs to see what real strength looks like, someone who thinks power means making the most noise, share this video with them. Your next story is waiting right there on your screen. Click it, and we'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves the same truth over and over. True strength doesn't need to announce itself. It just stands. And when it does, even the loudest voices discover they have nothing important to say.